6 months ago, I set out to document our family history. I wanted to capture the memories before they faded and dig into the official records to separate the myths from the facts. What I found was a story of survival, of grit, of flying doghouses and stolen dimes, and of a man who crossed an ocean to leave his name behind. I'm so excited to announce that I've turned our family story into an audiobook, and I want to share it with all of you. Over the coming months, we are going to travel from the soot-stained cobblestones of Dublin to the trenches of the First World War. We'll ride along for the great autoclave heist. We'll survive the Battle of the Thames Valley, and we'll remember the incredible men and women who built the branches of this family tree: Kathleen, Eileen, Jake, Tom, and Bob. Chapter 1, The Boy from the Liberties. You know, a name is a funny thing. Most of us are handed one before we can sit up straight, and we grow into it the way a sapling grows into its bark. It fits, it becomes us. We answer to it without thinking. We sign it at the bottom of birthday cards and checks and mortgage papers, and eventually it feels like something we built ourselves. But every now and then a name doesn't quite stick. It hangs there like a coat on the wrong peg, serviceable, respectable, but not quite yours. And somewhere along the way, when nobody's watching, you quietly hang it up in a closet, give a nod to the person you were, and walk away. This is the story of a man who did just that. Before he was Pat, the cabinet maker, the fervent Baptist, the steady-handed grandfather who built furniture that lasted and never raised his voice, he was Samuel John Carroll, born in Dublin in 1893. And the distance between Samuel and Pat wasn't just a name change, it was an ocean. It was a betrayal, and it was, in the end, a kind of forgiveness that came without ever quite forgiving. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before the ship, before the ocean, before the new name ever crossed anyone's lips, there was the cobblestone. The world of Samuel John Carroll didn't begin with the silence of the sea. It began with noise. It began with the clatter of iron-shod hooves on wet cobblestones. Clack, clackety, clack. The sound of a city that never quite slept, where carts rolled through the darkness delivering milk and coal, where the rhythm of hooves marked time more reliably than any church bell. And it began with a smell. If you've ever been to Dublin, anywhere near the brewery, you know the smell. Sweet and malty and heavy, like bread baking on a scale you can't quite comprehend. The scent of roasting grains from the Guinness brewery hung in the Dublin air like a permanent weather system, drifting over the Liffey and settling into the streets of the Liberties like fog that never burned off. It was the smell of industry, and for better or worse, it was the smell of home. Samuel was born on February 2, 1893. The official record states he was born at 50 Lower Clanbressel Street, in the heart of the Liberties, that ancient warren of narrow streets and soot-stained brick tenements where history wasn't written in books so much as it was worn into the stone and carried in the faces of the people who lived there. Now, the Liberties wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a world unto itself. It was a place where children played stick and hoop in muddy alleyways, and vendors hawked oysters and cabbages from wooden carts, their voices carrying over the cobblestones in a kind of musical argument that never quite resolved. It was a place where women in shawls sat on cold stone steps, gossiping and minding each other's business, because in the Liberties there were no secrets. If you laughed, the street laughed with you. If you cried, the street knew why before your own mother did. The buildings leaned in on one another like old men sharing confidences, their brick facades blackened by a century of coal smoke. Laundry lines stretched between them like haphazard spider webs, and if you looked up, which most people didn't, you wouldn't see much sky. Just the underside of someone else's washing. The air was a tapestry of smells, yeast from the breweries, the sharp, salty tang of the river Liffey at low tide, the ever-present damp that seemed to seep into your bones and settle there for the winter, and the acrid bite of burning peat that drifted from every chimney, mingling with coal smoke to create an atmosphere that was, if you're being honest about it, not particularly good for the lungs. This was Dublin at the turn of the century, a city of contradictions, a city where Georgian elegance and grinding poverty existed side by side, sometimes on the same street, where you could walk from Sackville Street, all grand hotels and electric lights, into the Liberties in 15 minutes, and find yourself in a different world entirely for a boy like Samuel. The grandeur of St. Stephen's Green or the wide pavements of Grafton Street might as well have been in London. His world was measured in blocks, in the distance between home and the parish school, in the geography of survival. His father was Thomas Carroll, a bricklayer. Now to be a bricklayer in a city built of brick was to have a trade, a skill, a certain dignity, but it was also punishing work. Thomas spent his days hauling hods of bricks, 100 weight at a time, up rickety ladders on building sites across a city that seemed to be constantly rebuilding itself. His hands were calloused and scarred, rough as the mortar he mixed, and when he came home at the end of the day, he carried the smell of wet brick and lime dust in his clothes. Thomas Carroll built walls for other people, strong walls, square walls, walls that would stand for 100 years. But he struggled to build stability for his own family because there was a shadow that followed Thomas home some nights, the shadow of the pub. In the slums of Dublin, the public house wasn't just a place to drink. It was a refuge, a warm, bright room where a man could escape the damp chill of a tenement flat shared by 7 people, where there was light and laughter and the companionship of other men who understood the weight of a day's labor, where for the price of a pint you could feel like someone who mattered. But it was also a place that could swallow a week's wages in a single evening, leaving nothing but uncertainty in its wake. And at the center of this precarious world, holding everything together with sheer force of will, was Samuel's mother, Margaret Doyle Carroll. She performed a daily miracle, the miracle of turning a bricklayer's unpredictable wages into food, heat, and patched clothing for 5 children. It was her hands that scrubbed the floors, her hands that mended clothes by the dim light of a gas lamp, her hands that stretched a pot of broth with potatoes and stale bread to feed a family. Her resilience was the bedrock, the thing that kept the family from sliding into the kind of poverty that didn't come back from. There was something else that set the Carrolls apart. In a city where life revolved around the Catholic parish, where the priest knew everyone's business and Sunday Mass was as inevitable as rain, the Carrolls were Church of Ireland, Protestants. It meant they were always slightly apart, different school, different rhythm to the year. It wasn't persecution exactly, but it was otherness. A low-level awareness that you were a minority in your own neighborhood, that you belonged to a different stream of the same river. For a quiet, observant boy like Samuel, that sense of being slightly outside would become part of who he was, a desire to belong somewhere, a determination to build a place where he could. The Carrolls valued literacy. Despite the poverty, despite the uncertain wages, Samuel and his siblings could all read and write. In the Liberties, that was no small thing. It was a window to another world, a ladder out if you knew how to climb it. By the time Samuel was old enough to remember clearly, the family had moved to 9 Digas Street, a single room, a microcosm of tenement life. The air inside was thick with peat smoke from the small corner hearth, the savory steam of boiling potatoes, and the damp that clung to wool blankets and stone walls no matter what you did. In the dim flicker of gaslight, the room was a constant negotiation of space. Thomas and Margaret slept on a worn mattress in one corner. The children, Thomasina, Samuel, Julia, Margaret, and young Thomas, shared straw-filled pallets on the floor, huddled together under threadbare quilts for warmth. Sounds were constant companions. The murmur of neighbors through thin walls, an infant's cry from the floor below, the heavy tread of boots on the communal staircase. Life was a rhythm of comings and goings, departures and returns. The first to leave each morning, long before the sun burned through the fog, was Thomasina. Samuel's older sister had joined the ranks of the factory girls, those pale-faced young women who walked through the dark streets in the pre-dawn hours, shawls pulled tight against the cold, heading to Jacob's or Boland's biscuit factories, those vast brick buildings that churned out biscuits for the entire British Empire and consumed the youth of Dublin's daughters in the process. The factory floor was hell, a deafening, rhythmic hell where the clatter and groan of machinery made conversation impossible and left your ears ringing long after you left. The air was a choking cloud of flour dust that coated your hair, your clothes, and settled deep in your lungs. For 10, sometimes 12 hours a day, Thomasina stood at her station, her hands performing the same motion thousands of times. Packing, sorting, stamping, mind-numbing work overseen by foremen who docked your pay for the slightest infraction. When she came home in the evening, she would slump by the fire, her face smudged with flour, too tired to speak. The only prize from her day was the occasional handful of broken biscuits she was allowed to bring home. Their sweet, buttery taste was a bitter consolation. For Samuel, watching his sister, this was a vision of a future he wanted no part of, a life as a cog in a vast, indifferent machine. Even as a boy, Samuel was different. His granddaughter Debbie would later recall him as a quiet one, a thinker, and that's exactly what he was. While his father and the other men of the neighborhood found their identity in physical labor and the loud camaraderie of the pub, Samuel found his in the quiet corridors of his own mind. In a world that valued brawn, he had a brain. The small Church of Ireland parish school was his sanctuary, a place of order, discipline, and most importantly, books. The education was rudimentary, designed to produce clerks and laborers, not scholars, but Samuel absorbed it all. He valued words, he valued the way they could unlock things, and one day his quiet intelligence earned him something extraordinary, a prize as his son Bob would later recall. Samuel had won it for memorizing Scripture, not just a verse or two, but most of the Scripture required by the Church of Ireland in Dublin. For a boy from the slums, the achievement was remarkable. The prize itself was extraordinary, a Bible. Not just any Bible, a beautiful copy bound in deep black leather, with the title, The Holy Scriptures, embossed in gold leaf that caught the light like a promise. The presentation day would have been unlike anything Samuel had experienced. The parish hall, with its tall windows letting in pale Dublin light. The rows of wooden chairs where parents and students sat, their Sunday clothes carefully brushed, the smell of furniture polish and prayer books, the nervous anticipation of children waiting to see whose name would be called. The Bishop of Dublin himself stood at the front, a man in vestments that seemed impossibly clean, impossibly white against the gray backdrop of the Liberties outside. When he called Samuel's name, the boy would have stood, knees probably shaking, and walked to the front of the hall. The bishop placed the Bible in his hands. The weight of it was surprising, substantial, real. The leather was smooth and cool against his palms, and when the bishop smiled, a brief, formal smile, but a smile nonetheless, Samuel felt something he'd never felt before. He felt seen. "You've a fine mind, young Carroll," the bishop might have said, or perhaps he said nothing at all. It didn't matter. The Bible in Samuel's hand said everything that needed saying. Samuel didn't run home. Running would have been dangerous, too easy to trip on the uneven cobblestones, to drop the precious book to damage it. So he walked carefully through the familiar chaos of the Liberties, holding the Bible against his chest like a shield, past the oyster sellers and the shawled women and the playing children, through streets where everyone knew everyone, but where no one, Samuel was certain, had ever won a prize like this. He showed it to his mother first. Margaret was at the hearth as always, stirring something in the black pot that hung over the peat fire. She wiped her hands on her apron, those hands that were never quite clean, never quite still, and took the Bible carefully, reverently, as if it might break. She traced the gold letters with one finger. Her lips moved slightly as she read the title, and Samuel realized she was probably the only other person in the family who could read it without help. "That's a grand thing, Sam," she whispered. "A grand, grand thing." There were tears in her eyes, not sad tears, proud tears, the kind of tears a mother cries when she sees her child break through a ceiling she'd never been able to reach herself. She handed it back to him carefully, as if returning something borrowed. "Mind it now," she said, "mind it well." The Bible was the center of Samuel's universe. In the evenings, while his siblings huddled together for warmth and his father was either working late or at the pub, Samuel would sit slightly apart with his prize. He would turn the pages with elaborate care, marveling at how thin they were, how you could almost see through them. The scent of new leather and fresh paper was intoxicating, a smell that had nothing to do with the liberties, nothing to do with poverty or peat smoke or desperation. He read passages he'd memorized, but they felt different now, more important, more real. The words on the page matched the words in his head, and that simple correspondence felt like proof of something larger, that what you learned, what you earned through effort, became truly yours. His younger siblings would lean over to look at it sometimes. Julia would touch the gold letters lightly, wonderingly. Even young Thomas, who could barely sit still, would go quiet in the Bible's presence, as if he understood it was something special, even if he couldn't read what it said. At night Samuel kept it under his pillow, or rather under the thin sack of straw that served as his pillow. He would lie there in the darkness, one hand resting on it, feeling its solid weight. It was proof of his worth, proof that he was more than just another mouth to feed, proof that he could be someone, and then it was gone. He came home from school to find the small room dimmer than usual, quieter. His mother was at the hearth, her back very straight, very still. Something in the set of her shoulders made Samuel's stomach clench before he even looked for the Bible. It wasn't under his pillow. It wasn't in the wooden crate where the family kept their few possessions. It wasn't anywhere. Samuel searched systematically the way you do when you're trying to stay calm, behind the peat stack under the mattress, in the corners where nothing lived except dust and the occasional mouse. But he already knew. The knowing had started the moment he'd seen his mother's rigid back. "Mom?" His voice came out smaller than he intended. "Mom, where's my Bible?" She didn't turn around, just kept stirring the pot, though whatever was in it was probably beyond needing stirring. "Mom." Her silence was a confession louder than any words. The ice in Samuel's stomach spread through his chest, down his arms, into his fingers. That evening, when Thomas came home, Samuel understood completely. His father's voice was too loud, too jovial. The smell of stout clung to him like a second skin. He sang half a verse of The Rising of the Moon in a tuneless baritone, stumbling slightly as he made his way to his corner of the room. The Bible, the beautiful black leather Bible with gold lettering, the Bible that had cost more than a bricklayer earned in a month, the Bible that proved Samuel was worth something, had been sold, traded for ale and companionship and a few hours of forgetting. Samuel said nothing. Boys in the Liberties learned early which battles couldn't be won. You didn't confront your father when he was drunk. You didn't make scenes. You didn't cry. You learned to swallow it down, to compress it into something small and hard and manageable. But that night, lying on his pallet in the darkness, listening to his father's snores and his mother's quiet, exhausted breathing, Samuel made a decision he would leave, not tomorrow, not next week, but someday when he was old enough, when he had a plan, he would leave this place, and he would build a life where prizes once earned stayed earned, where effort meant something, where nothing precious could be taken away for something temporary, and he would never ever forgive his father, not completely, not in the way that wipes the slate clean and starts fresh. Years later, as Pat, he would become a Baptist, a faith built on temperance and self-discipline. He would never touch alcohol, not once in his entire life. And when people asked why, he would give a small smile and change the subject. But the people who knew him best understood. The absence of drink in his life wasn't just a choice. It was a monument, a memorial to a black leather Bible that had disappeared into the Dublin night. Now here's where the family stories diverge. The official records say Samuel was 17 when he left for Canada. Born in 1893, departed in 1910, the math is straightforward, but his son Bob insisted his father left home when he was just 11 years old. Close to 12, Bob would say. In that version, the Bible's disappearance wasn't the beginning of a long plan. It was the final straw that sent a boy out into the world with nothing but fury and determination. The truth probably lies in the space between memory and documentation. Perhaps the Bible disappeared when Samuel was younger, planting a seed that took years to grow. Perhaps the memory telescoped time the way memories do, compressing years of quiet discontent into a single crystallizing moment. Or perhaps there were multiple departures, a boy leaving at 11, trying to make it on his own, and returning defeated before finally succeeding at 17. What we know for certain is this. On April 8, 1910, a 17-year-old named Samuel John Carroll departed Liverpool aboard the RMS Empress of Ireland. He was traveling with Fegan Homes, an evangelical Protestant organization founded by James William Condell Fegan that sent boys from Britain to Canada. These weren't the largest or most famous of the child migration agencies. That distinction belonged to Dr. Barnardo's. But Fegan Homes had their own character, their own particular approach. They emphasized moral reform, temperance, and the building of Christian character through hard work and rural life. Samuel was one of 38 boys making the crossing together, shepherded by a man in his 30s named Wortley Smith, listed on the passenger manifest as manager of boys' homes. On the official record, Samuel's birthplace was noted as England, not Ireland, a small detail that may have been clerical assumption or may have been Samuel's first deliberate act of reinvention. The journey from Dublin to Liverpool would have been Samuel's first great dislocation. A ferry crossing the Irish Sea, depositing him in the overwhelming industrial sprawl of Liverpool's docks, a forest of masts and funnels, cranes and warehouses stretching for miles along the Mersey, the air thick with coal smoke, the noise overwhelming here. In the days before departure, he would have been processed, forms filled out, medical inspections, a lecture about what was expected of boys going to Canada, instructions delivered by men who had shepherded thousands of boys before him and would shepherd thousands more after. On the morning of April 8, Samuel joined the others at the Liverpool docks, 37 other boys, ranging from 11 to 19 years old. Some were frightened, clinging to small bundles of belongings. Some were excited, already imagining the adventure ahead. Most were simply quiet, trying to comprehend the enormity of what they were doing. The RMS Empress of Ireland was magnificent, a Canadian Pacific liner of nearly 15,000 tons, with a black hull and twin cream and black funnels that dominated the waterfront. She was built for speed and comfort, or at least comfort for those who could afford first or second class. Samuel and the other Fegan boys would see none of that grandeur. They were directed to the steerage entrance, a dark opening in the ship's side, and descended a steep, narrow staircase, down into the belly of the vessel. Steerage was not designed for dignity. It was a cavernous, low-ceilinged space where the thrumming vibration of the ship's engines was a constant physical presence. The air was thick with competing smells, the metallic tang of steel, the sour smell of bodies, the lingering odor of whatever had been cooked in the mess, the acrid stench that would come later when the North Atlantic made its presence felt. Rows of metal-framed bunks stretched into the dim distance, stacked 3 high. Each bunk was a narrow shelf with a thin mattress and a single wool blanket. Samuel was assigned his spot. 6 feet of personal territory, in a space shared by hundreds around him, was a babel of languages and dialects. Irish accents like his own mixed with London Cockney, Scottish burrs, and the unfamiliar sounds of Eastern European families. Italian mothers hushing crying babies, Polish fathers arguing about something in rapid, incomprehensible syllables, everyone in the same boat, literally and figuratively, heading toward the same uncertain promise. The first day was manageable. The Empress pulled away from Liverpool with all the ceremony of any great departure. The blast of the horn, the shouts of stevedores, the gradual, majestic turning of the ship toward open water from the small steerage deck. Samuel watched the Liverpool waterfront recede, then disappear entirely. The second day was when the real voyage began. The Irish Sea gave way to the open Atlantic, and the Empress began to pitch and roll with a motion that was both rhythmic and nauseating. For someone who'd never been on water larger than the Liffey, the power of the ocean was terrifying. The ship, which had seemed so massive, so solid at the dock, suddenly felt fragile, a metal shell between you and the cold gray depths. The steel plates groaned. Water crashed over the forward decks with sounds like thunder. And below, in steerage, the suffering began. Seasickness is democratic. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor, brave or frightened. The constant motion of the ship, the stale air, the smells, all of it combined into a perfect recipe for misery. People who had been strangers hours before were now bound together in communal wretchedness. Samuel wedged himself into his bunk and held on. There was nothing else to do. The first 2 days were a blur of misery, punctuated by attempts to keep down the simple food served in the mess: watery porridge, weak tea, bread that was already going stale. But on the third day his body adjusted, or rather gave up fighting. The nausea receded to a manageable background hum, and Samuel could finally think about something other than survival. Life settled into a routine: meals at fixed times announced by the ship's bells, long stretches of boredom punctuated by brief periods on the steerage deck when weather permitted. The Fegan boys, thrown together by circumstance, began to form connections. Not deep friendships, there wasn't time for that, but the rough camaraderie of shared experience. They played cards on overturned crates. They told stories about where they'd come from and boasted about what they'd do in Canada. Farm work, most said, save money, buy land, build something. Samuel, characteristically, mostly listened. He was good at that, good at watching, absorbing, learning. While other boys talked, he observed the way Mr. Smith managed the group with a mixture of stern discipline and occasional kindness. The way some boys adapted quickly while others remained quietly terrified. The way the ship became its own small world, disconnected from everything that had come before. The steerage deck was salvation. When the weather was calm enough, the boys were allowed up the narrow stairs into fresh air and daylight. The shock of clean wind after the stale atmosphere below was almost painful, but it was glorious. Here Samuel saw things he'd never imagined. A horizon that was just a perfect circle of water meeting sky. No buildings, no church spires, no landmarks of any kind. Just endless blue. He watched dolphins arc through the waves alongside the ship. He saw flying fish burst from the surface and glide improbably through the air. At night, when they were allowed briefly on deck, the stars were so thick they seemed artificial, like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. On the sixth day, the character of everything changed. The water grew calmer, greener, seabirds appeared, first a few gulls, then increasing numbers. Land was near. On April 15, 1910, 7 days after leaving Liverpool, the Empress of Ireland steamed into the Bay of Fundy and approached St. John, New Brunswick. The approach was beautiful in its practicality. No dramatic cliffs or grand cathedrals, just a working harbor ringed by forested hills. The city rose in tiers from the water, brick buildings, church spires, the smoke of industry, patches of snow still clung to shaded areas. Spring came late here. The ship's horn blasted across the water, deep, resonant. Final tugboats nudged the Empress toward the dock with agonizing slowness. Mooring lines were thrown, caught, secured. The steady thrum of the engines, that sound that had been constant for a week, finally stopped. The silence was startling. In steerage, the passengers had been ready for hours. When the gangway finally opened, it wasn't orderly. It was a surge of humanity pouring out of the ship's belly into the chaos of the docks. Samuel's first steps on solid ground were disorienting. The earth seemed to roll and pitch with phantom motion. But there was no time to adjust. Mr. Smith was already organizing the Fegan boys, separating them from the family groups, herding them into a line. "Stay together," he called. "Don't wander, follow me." They were marched to the immigration shed, a long, low building that sprawled along the waterfront. Inside was controlled chaos, a vast hall filled with people, noise, and the sharp smells of disinfectant and bureaucracy. The process was efficient and impersonal. First, the medical inspection. Doctors in white coats moved quickly down the line, checking eyes for trachoma, scalps for lice, looking for any sign of deformity or disease. A chalk mark on your jacket meant rejection, a ticket back to where you came from. Samuel passed without incident. Next came the civil inspector, a man on a tall stool behind a desk. The ship's manifest open before him. Questions came rapid fire: name, age, birthplace, occupation, destination. Samuel answered. 17, England, or was it Ireland? Official entry into the Dominion of Canada, but they weren't free yet. The Fegan boys were led to a waiting area, hard benches, grimy windows looking out at a city they weren't yet part of. Hours passed. Through the windows, Samuel could see St. John rising up the hillside, a foreign place, a fortress of wood and stone. He hadn't yet earned the right to enter. Finally, they were marched to a railway platform. The train waiting for them was not what you'd call luxurious. A colonist car, hard wooden benches, a small cast-iron stove at one end, no compartments or privacy. This would be home for the next several days. As they traveled west toward Toronto, with a jolt and a hiss of steam, the train began to move. St. John slid past the window and disappeared into the vast Canadian wilderness. The ship was gone. The sea was gone. Samuel was now rattling westward through a continent, heading toward whatever waited at 295 George Street, Toronto. That address would become significant, because 295 George Street wasn't just any address. It was the Fegan home. The receiving house stood in what was then a working-class district of Toronto, east of Yonge Street, near the industrial core. The building had history. It had originally been a Gooderham property. The Gooderhams were one of Toronto's most prominent families, made wealthy by their distillery. By 1910, the building had been repurposed as the receiving station for boys arriving from Britain under Fegan's care. Here's where the story sharpens into documentary clarity. By the spring of 1911, less than a year after stepping off the Empress, the census records Samuel John Carroll living at that same address. Not wandering, not on a farm somewhere. Right there at 295 George Street, his occupation, packer and laborer, warehouse, his hours 90 per week, his wages $5.52 per week, his total earnings for 1910, $288 earned over the year. Think about that for a moment. 90 hours a week is 15 hours a day, 6 days a week. Lifting crates, rolling barrels, hauling freight, working in warehouses that were unheated in winter and airless in summer. And he did it every single week. Given the Gooderham connection to the building and the nature of warehouse work in that district, it's quite possible Samuel was working in or near the Gooderham and Wirtz Distillery Complex, one of the largest industrial operations in Toronto. The irony would not have been lost on him. The boy who'd lost his Bible to his father's drinking, working in a warehouse that likely handled spirits. But here's what those numbers tell us. This was not a boy adrift. This was someone who landed in April and immediately went to work. No wandering, no aimlessness. He found steady employment, put in brutal hours, and saved money. You don't work 90 hours a week if you're broken. You work 90 hours a week if you're proving something, building something, if you're determined never to go back. George Street in that era was survival Toronto, boarding houses, single men, railway workers, and warehouse hands. It wasn't genteel, but it was exactly where a 17-year-old immigrant with no connections and fierce determination would land. Eventually, Samuel would leave warehouse work. He would find his way to Hespeler, a mill town on the Speed River where he would discover his calling in a furniture factory. Cabinet-making work that required precision, patience, and the ability to build things that would last. It suited him perfectly. He would become a devout Baptist. He would marry. He would raise children, and he would never drink. Not once, not ever. When asked why, he would smile and change the subject. And somewhere in that transformation from Dublin to Toronto, from warehouse to workshop, from Samuel to Pat, he built something more valuable than any Bible. He built a life where prizes once earned stayed earned. Names are funny things. Sometimes you inherit them. Sometimes you survive them. And sometimes, if you're determined enough and willing to cross an ocean to do it, you build a new one with your own two hands. The boy named Samuel left Dublin with nothing but a vow. The man named Pat built a life of permanence, and that, in the end, was its own kind of forgiveness.